Anthropic just told the world that their new model is so powerful, so catastrophically capable, that releasing it to the general public could collapse cybersecurity infrastructure, destabilize national security, and cause economic damage severe enough that the U.S. Treasury Secretary and the Federal Reserve Chair felt the need to sit down with bank CEOs and warn them about it. And then they did not release it, which means right now we are all just sitting here, refreshing our feeds, watching a company tell us they have built something that could break the internet while simultaneously deciding that people like you and me are simply not responsible enough to have it. Welcome to the new AI release playbook, except this time the stakes are apparently high enough that Anthropic named their model after ancient mythology and locked it in a vault. The model is called Mythos, and whether it is actually the civilization-ending zero-day machine Anthropic claims it is, or just the most expensive marketing campaign in tech history, we need to talk about what it allegedly does, why the establishment is already losing sleep over it, and whether any of this is actually as terrifying as it sounds. There is something deeply familiar about this moment. Midjourney was going to make every human artist obsolete overnight, and now nobody talks about it. GPT-4 had an entire corner of the internet experiencing emotions they had never processed before. Every major model release arrives wrapped in existential dread and departs, leaving the world roughly as intact as it found it. So when Anthropic rolls out the announcement that Mythos is too dangerous for public consumption, the part of your brain that has been through this cycle before is already reaching for the skepticism shelf. But here is the thing that makes Mythos different from the usual hype. The thing that vulnerabilities in actual software that you are actually running, that changes the conversation in a way that no amount of pattern recognition about AI hype cycles can fully neutralize. Let us start with what Mythos supposedly found during internal testing, because the vulnerability list reads less like a benchmark result and more like a threat actor's Christmas wish list. And before we get into the specifics, it is worth noting that Anthropic has been using Mythos internally since February 24th. That is a meaningful window of deployment, long enough to accumulate real findings, long enough to watch those findings get verified by independent security researchers who confirmed the vulnerabilities were genuine before patches were issued. Long enough for the US government to urgently call emergency briefing meetings with bank executives. Whatever else you think about the framing and the marketing and the benchmark conditions, the timeline here is not the timeline of a company generating hype around capabilities that do not exist. It is the timeline of a company that found something real and spent weeks figuring out what to do about it before telling anyone. First up, a 16-year-old vulnerability in FFmpeg. If you have ever processed video on any piece of software in the last decade and a half, you have almost certainly used FFmpeg without knowing it. It is everywhere. It is in browsers, media players, streaming platforms, editing software, basically any application that needs to handle video at the infrastructure level. The vulnerability Mythos found allows an attacker to craft a malicious video file, something that looks completely normal, something you would open without a second thought, that tricks the decoder into writing data outside its allowed memory boundary. A few bytes outside the line, that is all it takes. The program crashes, nearby data gets corrupted, and depending on how that corruption lands, you now have a foothold in a system that had no idea it was being attacked via a video file. 16 years this bug was sitting there. 16 years of every security researcher, every penetration tester, every automated scanner running across FFmpeg's codebase. Mythos found it in weeks. Then there is the OpenBSD bug, 27 years old. OpenBSD, for those not deep in the Unix world, is the operating system that the security community has historically treated as one of the gold standards for hardened lockdown systems. It is the OS that security-conscious developers reach for when they genuinely care about not getting compromised. And sitting inside it for 27 years was a null pointer write vulnerability that allows a remote attacker to instantly crash any OpenBSD machine reachable over TCP. No authentication, no user interaction. Just send the right packet to the right port and the machine goes down. The fact that Mythos found this in OpenBSD specifically is the kind of thing that makes the people who thought they were safe feel significantly less safe. But the browser exploits are where things get genuinely cinematic. Across every major browser, Mythos found JavaScript engine bugs that allow a malicious web page to escape the browser sandbox. The sandbox is the thing standing between a web page you visit and your actual operating system. It is the reason you can browse the internet without every sketchy ad network having full access to your file system. When you break out of the sandbox, you have broken the fundamental security assumption that makes the modern web usable. In one case, the sandbox escape allowed cross-site data theft. In another, it allowed direct writes to the operating system kernel, meaning the moment a victim opened the page, an attacker had full control of the device. Not partial access, not read-only access, full control from a web page that you opened in your browser like a normal person. And then there is the one that genuinely deserves a moment of silence. The Linux kernel bug that allowed Mythos to flip a single bit in a neighboring memory page. 1 bit. In doing so, it turned the password executable into a writable file. It then overwrote that file and gained full root access to the system. The elegance of that attack is almost offensive. 1 bit. The entire security model of a Linux system, the permissions architecture, the user privilege separation that the entire enterprise computing world depends on, collapsed because of 1 bit being in the wrong state. Security researchers who spent their careers finding vulnerabilities are out there saying they found more bugs in the last couple of weeks interacting with Mythos than in the rest of their careers combined. That sentence should be sitting uncomfortably in the back of your mind right now. So naturally, Anthropic's response to building what appears to be an autonomous vulnerability research machine was to form a club. Specifically, Project Glasswing, which is a new initiative bringing together a collection of companies that, entirely coincidentally, pay Anthropic a significant amount of money with the goal of securing the world's most critical software using Mythos before anyone else builds something with comparable capability. The theory is that if you can find all the holes before the bad actors do, you can patch them first, and the world is net safer. It is a reasonable theory. It is also a theory that requires you to trust that a small group of trillion-dollar corporations and financial institutions operating with privileged access to the most capable vulnerability-finding system ever built will use that access exclusively for defense and will share the higher findings promptly and completely with the rest of the world, which, if your prior on how trillion-dollar corporations behave is anything other than perfectly charitable, you might have some questions about. The U.S. Treasury Secretary and the Federal Reserve Chair setting up urgent meetings with bank CEOs to warn them about Mythos is the detail that tells you this has moved beyond the usual AI hype cycle. Treasury secretaries do not call emergency meetings with bank leadership over AI models that are going to replace copywriters or generate marketing images. When that meeting gets called, it means the people responsible for systemic financial stability have looked at what Mythos can do to software infrastructure and decided that the banking sector, which runs on software, needs to understand that a new category of risk has entered the room. That is not a marketing stunt. That is a genuine institutional alarm response. But here is where the story gets more complicated than the headlines suggest, because not everyone is convinced that Mythos is quite the omnipotent hacking deity that the announcement implies. The OpenBSD vulnerability, for example, came out of approximately 1,000 parallel agent runs across the codebase at a compute cost of nearly $20,000. That is not a model casually browsing source code and stumbling onto a critical bug. That is a brute force parallel search at significant expense that happened to surface a real vulnerability. The important question is whether the same process run with Anthropic's current flagship model or with competing models from OpenAI or Google would produce similar results given similar compute investment. Because if the answer is yes, then what Anthropic has demonstrated is not that Mythos has some qualitatively new capability for finding vulnerabilities. It is that throwing enough compute at code analysis finds bugs, which we already knew. The question of whether Mythos represents a genuine capability leap or an expensive demonstration of existing techniques dressed up in mythology, themed branding is not yet fully answered. The Firefox benchmark numbers are doing something similar. The claim is that Mythos achieved an 84% success rate at writing working exploits for Firefox. That is compared to 15% for Opus 4.6, which sounds like a categorical leap until you read the fine print. The benchmark was not run against actual Firefox. It was run against a SpiderMonkey shell, the JavaScript engine. With the process, sandbox, and other mitigations explicitly disabled, the sandbox is doing a lot of the work in real-world Firefox security, testing exploit writing capability against a version of the engine, with the primary defensive layer removed, and then presenting the results as evidence of a dramatic capability jump is the kind of methodology that deserves significant scrutiny. It is not that the results are fabricated, it is that the conditions under which they were achieved are not the conditions under which real-world attackers operate, which means the headline number is doing more marketing work than scientific work. And there is the small matter of Anthropic's own operational security track record since Mythos was deployed internally on February 24th. In that period, Claude Code source code leaked. Internal documents revealing the existence of Mythos leaked before the official announcement. The APIs have had a genuinely rough time staying online. If Mythos is sophisticated enough to find 27-year-old bugs in hardened operating systems and escape browser sandboxes across every major browser, one might expect that the organization operating it would have a somewhat tighter grip on their own internal documents and source code. The gap between the capability being claimed and the operational reality being demonstrated is noticeable enough that skepticism is not just reasonable, it is the scientifically appropriate response. None of which means Mythos is not a real step up from current models. It probably is. The vulnerability findings, even accounting for the compute costs and the benchmark conditions, represent something that existing automated security tools were not producing. Finding a 16-year-old FFmpeg bug and a 27-year-old OpenBSD bug in the same testing period is not nothing, regardless of how much compute it took. The question is whether those findings represent a model that has crossed some qualitative threshold into genuinely unprecedented territory, or whether they represent a quantitative improvement that is significant but not civilization-altering. Anthropic says the former. The evidence so far is more consistent with the latter, but since Mythos is not available to independent researchers to verify either way, we are all operating on trust. And that is the part of this story that matters most beyond the specific vulnerability findings and the benchmark debates. The decision about whether a technology is safe enough for public access is being made by the company that built it, with financial incentives pointing in a specific direction, using internal testing that cannot be independently verified, and resulting in a policy that grants privileged access to the technology to the companies most capable of paying for that privilege. Project Glasswing is not a safety initiative in the way that phrase is normally understood. It is a controlled release to a curated set of customers dressed up in safety language. The framing that Mythos is too dangerous for default config users, but perfectly safe in the hands of trillion-dollar corporations and central bank officials, is not a safety argument. It is a business model. And it is worth sitting with the discomfort of that framing for longer than the news cycle typically allows, because the implications of normalizing that logic extend well beyond this one model release. If the precedent being set here is that the most capable AI tools go first, and exclusively to the institutions with the most money and the most political proximity to the people making the decisions, then the question of who benefits from AI capability and who gets protected from AI risk starts to have a very predictable answer. The answer is not you. The AI hype cycle has a pattern that is familiar enough by now to recite from memory. Capability announcement with alarming framing. Media coverage emphasizing the most extreme possible interpretations. Community debate, split between true believers and dismissive skeptics. Quiet release that lands somewhere between the two poles. Repeat with the next model. Mythos is following that pattern closely enough that the skeptics have a legitimate point. But the specific nature of what Mythos allegedly found, real vulnerabilities in real software that real systems depend on, gives the true believers more to work with than usual. The bugs were real. The patches are real. The Treasury meeting was real. Something happened here that is more than pure marketing theater, even if the framing around it is doing more theatrical work than the underlying capability strictly requires. Whether Mythos destroys the world is, in the considered judgment of anyone paying close attention, almost certainly no. Whether it represents a meaningful step in the direction of AI systems that can autonomously find and exploit vulnerabilities at scale, at a pace that human security researchers cannot match, in code bases that have resisted decades of manual review, that question is considerably less comfortable to dismiss. It is a big club. You are not in it. And the people who are in it are currently deciding what gets patched, in what order, with what level of transparency, using a tool that found bugs in software you use every day before you had any idea it existed.